I'm Alison Eyring, organization psychologist, CEO, and endurance athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organizational challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special kind of leader to successfully grow a business. I call them growth leaders. These leaders have an edge for growth. This allows them to drive performance today while transforming their business for tomorrow while keeping their people energized. So whether you're starting a company or reigniting a team within a large, mature company, I'll show you what it takes to successfully drive business growth through conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. In this episode, I speak to Troy Engle. He's the head of Academies and Clubs for Sports Singapore. Troy's a growth leader of sports organizations, a developer of coaches, and a former Olympic coach. I want to learn from him more about the world of sports coaching and how we can apply this to the world of business and leadership. Welcome, Troy. Thanks for being here today with me on Growth Leaders.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Alison. It's good to see you, too.
So, Troy, I want to get to know you just a little bit, and I wanted to know, what is it that led you to study sport management? Because I noticed that you studied economics as an undergraduate, and then after that you did a master's in sport management. What is it that led to that decision?
Yeah, kind of a typical confused young kid, I guess. I think I was probably destined to go into education in some form or fashion. Both my parents were teachers, but I went to a small liberal arts college in the U.S. called Amherst College, and went in at 17, thought I probably wanted to be a Supreme Court justice at some point, or a lawyer. Yeah, right. Then realized that that probably wasn't what I wanted to do, and economics seemed like the right thing to do because there may be a job waiting at the end. But about 2 years into it, I said, you know, I think I kind of like this coaching thing, but didn't really know how to do it, but didn't know where to go to do it. So I just finished out my degree in economics, and then spent a year training and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And then when I figured out that coaching or sports administration was really what I wanted to do, went back and did a master's in sport management. And at that point, it happened that one of the best graduate programs in sport management happened to be in the same town in Massachusetts where I went as an undergraduate. So it was kind of a match made in heaven. But truthfully, I have to admit there was a little element to it that at that point in time, most of the coaching job says bachelor's degree required, master's preferred.
So you said, like, that's it, baby.
Okay, that's the one that makes sense.
Right. And were you an athlete at that point?
Yeah, I was a track and field person, track and field athlete. That was the sport that I thought I would end up coaching, and it was the sport. Played some basketball. You can't tell.
Now I see why you're such a fan of the Singapore
Slingers. Yeah, when you're
Slingers.
little and you're taller than everybody else, they push you towards that. And then when you kind of stop growing and everybody else keeps growing,
you're out of time.
Yeah. So I went to track and field and liked it, and had a college coach. It was a great influence on me. And, you know, in retrospect, as I look back, I think I was destined to follow my mom and dad into the classroom, and I just identified that the field of play, or the track in this case, was going to be my classroom. So
nice.
That's where I ended up where I was.
So you've spent your entire life working with athletes, coaching athletes, teaching coaches of athletes how to be better coaches. Who's the one athlete that you most admire, and why?
Good question. Can I answer that in a couple different ways?
As long as it's short.
Okay. I would say pure athleticism, there'd be a handful. I mean, there have been a number of tremendous athletes. I think, in my mind, I'll throw you one that you probably don't think of. The most dominant athlete in the world right now in their sport is a woman named Tatiana McFadden, who is the most dominant wheelchair track and field athlete in the world. And she's an amazing story.
And what is it that you most admire about her?
Her grit and determination, her versatility. She's been the best in the world from the sprints all the way through the marathon. Incredible story, too. Born in an orphanage in Russia. Her adoptive mother found her there, walking on her hands, and brought her back. And Tat's just an amazing young woman, a graduate of the University of Illinois, but just the most incredibly dominant athlete.
And do you think the grit is just... Was it because she learned how to cope with what life hit her with, or is it that was part of her personality?
Maybe both. I mean, it would be hard to separate probably her experiences from what molded her personality. But she's also one of the nicest, softest people you've ever met as well. That's a very interesting comment because, the UK, they've done some studies about world-class athletes, and they've found that most of them have had some trigger, some kind of a trauma in their life. The really high-performing ones that has accelerated their determination and their grit. And it can be they come from a broken home or they've had some trauma in their childhood. But I think, or in the case of like Michael Jordan, they get cut from a team and that kind of ignites their passion.
Right.
So I think it's a combination of both.
Which is interesting, consistent with research on leadership.
Yeah.
About how often very difficult situations or failure as a leader becomes a catalyst for future success.
Yeah, but ultimately that's, what Sam Walton from Walmart, when he was asked what the secret of success was, as he said, good decisions. And ultimately look back, how do you make good decisions?
You make lots of bad ones.
Lots of bad decisions,
Exactly.
right? So, that's what experience is learning from your bad experiences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I want to know, you're so surrounded by this world of coaching. Are you capable of turning that off? Like you and I love to watch the Singapore Slingers, and now I understand from your background in basketball. Can you switch off your coach lens when you go there and just enjoy the game?
Go to sporting events?
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes. I've had that conversation a lot of times. I don't usually go to a lot of sporting events. And people that are non-sports friends of mine look at me and they go, why don't you go to every major sporting event? And I'm like, why don't you go to every business opportunity you can? I mean, if you're a doctor, do you sit and watch other people perform surgery? I'd probably sometimes, but not all the time.
Not all the time.
There are some sports I like. I do find myself when I go to watch sports, I tend to watch things that other people don't. I watch for the athleticism involved in the event. And I do, like the Slingers, I probably know more about every other team's coach than I do about most of their players.
Oh, interesting.
I kind of watch their coaching style.
Right.
So, I think I do see it through that lens.
Right. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, you're also the father of two adorable children. How does coaching affect you as a dad?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think coaching can be humbling, but parenting can be
even more so.
Even more humbling, right? I guess the sharp answer would be that there are times that you always feel like you may be getting a little better as a coach, but we all know as a parent that every day you wake up and you go, oh my God, I have no idea if I'm getting any better or worse on this. I think the thing that it does, having multiple children in particular, is it shows you how different kids even within the same family can be. And in coaching sport and in coaching as a leader, let's say within the business setting, the term we use in sport coaching is being athlete-centered, right? You meet the needs of each of your individual athletes. And even from a training perspective, there may be some predictability in what the training response will be, but it's not absolute. Every even scientific physiological study is really just the average response, right? Everybody responds differently. And within your family, your kids can be radically different. My son and daughter, the two little ones, 13 months apart, couldn't be more different. So it's kind of forced me to practice my parenting skills, being more child-centered, right? And that's what teachers learn, how to be, student-centered. When we approach business, now that I've stepped away from sport coaching and into the civil service, I realize that not every person that works for me on the team responds to the same style of leadership. So I think
that's exactly what I was thinking as you were saying that. I was thinking, well, even in medicine, you talk about being patient-focused. As a leader, your sample size is one. That every employee will have different needs, and the way to develop them or to coach them or to get the best out of them is different.
That's right. Yeah.
Coming up in the next segment.
You can't be expected to have absolute knowledge and expertise in everything, and so you have people who may know more about what they do than you do.
You're listening to Growth Leaders, a podcast with Alison Eyring.
So I'm really interested in what some of your insights from dealing with really elite athletes. I want to ask you a little bit about your experience working with athletes whose performance stalls, because this is a common issue for a leader. How do I keep my employees growing and learning and developing and improving their performance? So tell me what you do. What do you do when an athlete's performance stalls? How do you get them to the next level?
I will tell you that I've been lucky, I think, in my own coaching career in that I've always coached an individual sport. So that has made those instances easier. I've often wondered if I coached a basketball team or a football team where you've got 11 different people who may have different physiological responses, and then you're coaching the team dynamics as well as the individual. That creates an entire different layer of complexity that you have to deal with. But ultimately, it still boils down to what I practiced every day, which is the response to everything in the system is different for every person, right? So the fine line when somebody's performance stalls is trying to determine whether the system has been over or under stressed.
Say more about that. What's the system? What makes it up?
Well, the system in the case of an athlete could be the physiological system. Mm-hmm. It could be whether they're overtrained or undertrained. Or are you applying the correct amount of overload and recovery to the system to allow it to perform at its best? But there's also the emotional element of that. I mean, and that's the other piece. So it's not just physiological. It's also psychological. It's emotional.
Right. I was going to ask you that. When you see the sort of a stall, do you see that it's most often a result of a physiological issue or a psychological?
I hate to use this answer, but the answer would be it depends, because
Right.
it could be
You're
either one, right?
Or
it could be both.
Right.
I mean, because I think the thing that we all have to realize is that no single stress impacts the system, whether that's the physiological system, the overall person system, or even a team system. It doesn't affect it in isolation, right? Physiological stress or long hours, it's not just the lack of sleep that impact. It could be then the stress that it creates between the people that creates more stress. So it can be a combination of home stress and work stress and physiological stress. And all of those things combined are what can impact a person's ability to respond and come back.
So it sounds like an important component of that then is also to be able to communicate very well with that individual, because only they're going to be able to reveal enough information that helps you understand what's keeping them back.
And that's the coaching piece, isn't it? And that's what I think good performance coaches, and I'm not talking about sports coaches, because I think there's even a little difference there, but good leaders, the difference between a leader and a manager maybe, right? A leader is one that's got to kind of meet the needs of those being led and know what they need, whereas a manager is just task-focused. A leader kind of realizes that the ultimate greatest success of the organization comes from everybody have kind of co-ownership of the process. And the only way they can feel that is if they feel part of it and they feel as if there's a connection. And I think that's your point, which is perfect.
And so you had talked about understanding the what's causing the performance to stall. What would you say is the biggest thing that helps a person then get to the next level? There
could be a number of things. It could be technical. It could be that they don't have the technical ability to be able to perform the task. There may be some level of learning or training that might need to be done in order for them to learn it. It could be mechanical, that they don't have the fitness level, they don't have the ability to be able to do it. It could just be psychological, that they don't have the confidence that they can yet do it. And all of those things, and I'm sure there are others, if I thought about it a little bit more, could be contributing to their ability. So, and I think the same could be true for somebody to be able to do a job. I mean, if you tell somebody, I need you to do this job, if they don't know how to do it, you can't will somebody to be able to do it. If they haven't ever done it before, they may not have the confidence to be able to do it. That's the part that's been a real amazing thing for me to shift out of sport coaching into leading in the public sector right now, is that in sport coaching, the assumption is that the coach has a certain level of expertise that is hopefully more than most of the people on the team, sees things from a different perspective, but knows enough about each of the players and the position to be able to give them guidance in what they should do in their role. You know, and I would suspect most CEOs, I can only use my small world, you don't know every single person in your organization's job better than they do. You may not be an expert in every role. You have to rely upon them. And that's a fundamental difference, because I think the way that a sport coach often coaches is from a position of having a level of expertise, which in a leadership perspective is different. You can't be expected to have absolute knowledge and expertise in everything. And so you have people who you have to lead who may know more about what they do than you do.
So you have to enlist them more in
That's right.
figuring out what actually the solution should be.
Which means that they even have to have, you have to have better communication
Yeah.
skills with them, because they have to
Yeah.
trust that respect and
Exactly.
understand the respect.
Or maybe leverage other people in
That's
the team as well.
Yep.
Coming up in the next segment.
But the leadership from within the team. So it's a shared leadership. That shared leadership brings this shared energy and shared vision.
You're listening to Growth Leaders, a podcast with Alison Eyring.
Now, tell me, Troy, you clearly are in an industry where energy is really important for performance. Talk to me a little bit about how you think about energy, and how do you think about energy for yourself as well as for others?
Your book sums it up, right? I mean, I think it's all about pacing. I mean, energy, you can at times extend yourself, and extending yourself is not a bad thing. The only way that the system can get better is by proving that it can expand its limits. But you have to understand that that period of expansion has to be followed by a period of recovery and adaptation, right? And that's even from the cellular level. I mean, if you read stuff that goes all the way back to Hans Selye, who's this Austrian scientist who wrote this theory called the general adaptation syndrome, he talks about how the entire human organism is this process of load and recovery, right? That's what creates the improvement of homeostasis. So that's the ultimate magic tool that we have, right, is figuring out how much we can push it without breaking it. When we have to back off to allow a little bit of recovery, and then pushing out again.
Right.
It's that contraction, expansion, load, recovery,
Yes.
whatever you want to call it. That's the toughest thing, particularly the more people you've got involved. It's easier if you've got a team of several, but I think when you've got a team of a lot, then it's even harder to have as close monitoring of all of that. And that's why the people that are with you and around you have to be enlisted in that support.
I really love that, the idea of load and recovery, because in most organizations, if you ask about energy, people think about, oh, I'm going to go on vacation, I'm going to withdraw. And I always say, oh, yeah, that's a great example of just passive recovery, which is great after exertion.
Yeah.
And so I think what you're saying is that it's that the load is as important as the recovery in order to improve your energy and your strength.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be vacation, right? I used to have this big joke. If you talk to the coaches or the athletes I've had for 30 years, whenever I started a season, the new ones would come in and the athletes would go, what days are we working out this week? And the older athletes would say, oh, here it comes. And I'd look at them, I go, we're working out every day. What are the days that are
in training?
The really
thinking.
hard ones?
Yeah.
And I'm going, they're all workouts.
Right.
Even our easy days are by design. Every single thing we do is with a purpose. So while you think this may be a recovery day, that meets a need, right? And who is to say what makes you feel better is the same that makes me feel better? What do people do to regenerate, regroup? So that's the part, again, that's the individual part of coaching or leading, I
Right.
think.
I really love that. I think about that also when I talk about, in my book, I wrote about rule of exert and then recover,
Yeah.
right? One of the intelligent restraint rules. And I think the word intentional is an important one. So it's that we're intentional in how we exert ourselves, and we're not just busy.
Right.
And that intentionality allows us to develop and to improve our own performance. Without that, the recovery is worthless.
That's right.
So what about with a group? Because I really think that energy isn't just about, it's not an individual attribute, it's also a collective attribute, and that you can sense it, you feel it when you walk into an organization and there's just this buzz, or you're with a team and you just feel this collective energy. So how do you build that?
That's a really good question, and it's been one that I've started to try to study more and more, which is what are the common elements of teams that I've coached that have had really good chemistry. And then you look outside and say, what are the things that make the great teams? What is it about their culture that has created that kind of universal focus? And I think everything you read, everything you know, and everything you've experienced probably points back down to the thing that we talked about, which is safety in an environment where everybody shares a common vision. In a sports environment, if it's very coach-centered, if the coach is the center of all of the energy, then the athletes have a pass. They don't have to bring the same level of energy. The coach will tell us the goals. The coach has set the benchmarks. We just follow. The great ones, though, that even if you look at sports analogies like the Golden State Warriors right now or the San Antonio Spurs, they have a unique culture that comes in where they all buy into it, which is part of, that shared vision. Absolutely bring up the energy because there's not just a shared vision, but then there's a shared responsibility to each other. There's this co-ownership of all of it that I think creates that buzz. And it doesn't come from what you would traditionally call the leader all the time, too. If you look at, there was a study done in a book called The Captain's Class, where they looked at some of the best sport teams in the history of the last 100 years, and they talk about the importance of athlete leadership, not the coaching leadership, but the leadership from within the team. So it's a shared leadership. That shared leadership brings the shared energy and shared vision.
I love that. That's something that has changed in my own thinking over the years, is around kind of moving beyond just thinking of leadership as coming from the leader, but the idea that there's collective leadership, which is more than just shared leadership. It's about collective ownership for outcomes and for performance.
Yeah, it has to be. I absolutely agree. Yeah.
Coming up in the next segment.
20 years before, I was convinced I was at the top of my game, right? But the more you do it, the more you realize that you don't know. You've got a lot of room for improvement.
You're listening to Growth Leaders, a podcast with Alison Eyring.
You've worked through the years with many coaches. What have you learned about how to become the best coach?
I think the biggest thing is to realize that you're never the best coach.
Say more about that.
I'll put it in deeply personal terms. I was really privileged in that 2016, I was one of the coaches of the U.S. Olympic team in Rio. And it's kind of the culmination of a coaching career, that when you get to coach on the Olympic stage, it's
doesn't get much better than
right?
that.
I look back, and I suspect that was after 30-something years of coaching. My guess is 25 years ago, I probably said, wow, someday I want to be able to do that, right? And then maybe 10, 15 years later, I was like, why hasn't my time come? I'm ready, I'm at the top of my game. And then when it finally got there and I walked out to Rio, I kind of walked out and I'm like, what the heck am I doing here?
Or what am I doing? What am I impacting?
Why me? I mean, I'm not worthy, And I think that was kind of probably, as I sat around with all the coaches there, we just kind of realized that, man, we're really lucky to be here because we're not probably at the top of our game yet. 20 years before, I was convinced I was at the top of my game, right? But the more you do it, the more you realize that you don't know. You kind of realize that you've got a lot of room for improvement. And I think that's the best coaches across sports, across countries, the best coaches here. I see them being the ones that seek out coaches from other sports and talk about coaching because they're always looking for the edge. They're always trying to find out, what can I learn from someone that's going to help my athletes get better? And I think that's the other focus. It becomes an other focus. When the focus is on how do I get better as a coach, it's not as kind of, it has a different lens than when you get to a point, and I think it's very natural that it happens through maturation, as you realize, okay, I got to get better at helping the people around me. My focus now has to be not just on honing my skills. My skills have gotten adequate enough. Now I got to figure out how I can use them better by being more aware of what the people around me need.
So it sounds like two things come to mind as I listen to you. One is about the importance of humility, and the other is about making that mental shift from being a know-it-all to a learn-it-all.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I guess vulnerability is part of that too, right? Humility and vulnerability. I really like that. This is one thing from the podcast I'm stealing from you.
Well, it's interesting because vulnerability, when people show their vulnerability, it is a sign of trust.
Yeah.
And so, again, you keep talking about this relationship and being focused on the person that you're helping, and you actually paying less attention to, I got to know it all, I got to really help, I got to set the direction to, how do I lift them up? How do I help them lift themselves up?
That's really hard for a leader, isn't it? I mean, I remember when I was 25, as an example, everybody's going to call me coach. That title was going to give me the respect that I needed, right? And that was really critical, that people knew that I knew a lot. The older you get, I think that becomes, or the more experienced, I shouldn't make it age related, but the more experience that we get, we realize that that's not what really separates you from the rest of them.
Right. Yeah. So I've got this question that's really personal for me because, I do triathlons, and I'm really interested in growth leaders and the challenges that growth leaders have. And growth leaders do something quite special in that they are able to deliver results at the same time they're building capabilities for the future, and they're also energizing themselves in teams. So I think of that like a triathlon. So from your perspective as a coach, how do you help leaders become that kind of triathloner? How do you help them become a growth leader?
Well, I think it's a lot of what you mentioned earlier. It has to come from the engagement of the leader or the learner or the athlete in their own development. Again, if they don't have that ownership, then it's almost always just results focused, right? It's all around the performance. There's not as much focus on the other legs of the triangle of the experience. How do we learn from what we've just done? What are the other pieces that we take from this experience that does things like build the capacity and that you talked about and the capabilities? So I think that's the central piece. The central piece is not just providing a pill that if you take it, you'll get better. It's to co-create the process of getting better along with the participants, because then ultimately it's more of them and less of you. And when they're invested in it, it's not just about the performance. It's about noticing how it can sustain itself through the other things that you talked about, through their own energy level, by supporting each other, both individual energy level and team energy level, but also how the system can kind of adapt and grow. Because ultimately, then you realize that someday I'm going to have to take this over. It's not going to be just by direction. It's going to be, I'm going to have to guide this by myself. So I think, again, it's all part of the process of empowering the people or the parts of the system.
So I know you're a track and field coach. Historically, that was your background. And so some people in track and field will do multiple sports. What specifically do you do differently with a multi-sport athlete versus a single sport athlete?
Let me start out by saying that I think that at the foundational level, and this is one of the things that we're really trying to make an impact here in Singapore is, and I think it's true with globally, not just within sport, is that early specialization is not always the best route. I think that if you can develop capabilities through multi-experiences, and in the case of sport, it's through a multi-sport experience, it builds a more robust system that can take the hits and bounce back better. So I think from a developmental perspective, having people that have resilience through a better balance of a lot of different skill sets and better critical thinking skills even. I'm not talking about technical skills only. I'm talking about people that can kind of see the bigger picture is of value. Multi-sport athlete, obviously what you have to try to do is to try to find, because we used to have kids that would come off of the football field, and then in the spring or the soccer pitch, and then in the spring season in North America would come out for track. You'd have to say, okay, where do they start from? What are they bringing? What attributes are they bringing from that experience that we have to build on those strengths, and then identify what the weaknesses of their current situation is, their current reality that we have to address to bring up the speed. So it was really a matter of kind of figuring out what you could rely upon that they had already in the bank, and then trying to figure out what specific attributes you needed to develop in addition.
So it sounds like an important lesson for leaders who want to grow growth leaders is to ensure that they have breadth of experiences across the perform, the energize, and the transform, and also that then they learn from that experience to then get deeper expertise in each of those areas.
I think that's right, yeah. And I think, obviously, if you've got a breadth of those experiences, then you've got a little bit more versatility, too. And it can also lend itself to greater collaboration rather than just people working in silos, that I'm a specialist, this is my world, this is all I do, and that's all I know.
Great. Troy, it's been great talking to you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alison. This was fun. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Growth Leaders wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment and a rating. We'd love to hear what you think. If If you have questions about growth or growth leadership, please email us at growthleaders@organizationsolutions.com. Growth Leaders is produced by Organization Solutions in partnership with MediaCorp. Many thanks to Dee Kirk, Sean Young, Barry Toe, Keith Tan, Zach Rassley, and Susan Eyring.